Months after the verdict was announced, when the media storm had finally subsided and the cameras had been shut off, when the courtrooms had been cleared and the headlines had changed, something remarkable started to occur. The individuals who had been closest to O.J. Simpson, those who had defended him in public, supported him in private, and believed in him most strongly, slowly started speaking. These were no reporters eager for a scoop. They were no jurors sworn to the trial rules. They were friends, allies, confidants. Individuals who had witnessed the private O.J., the one removed from the flashing cameras and court theater. And when they started to talk, the story changed. What surfaced wasn't hearsay or rumor, it was raw, personal, and at times, frighteningly near a confession. They spoke one after another about telling stories that painted a very different picture of the man who had been America's football hero. Mike Gilbert was more than O.J. Simpson's sports agent, he was his buddy. For over 20 years, Gilbert had assisted in Simpson's career management, defended his public image, and negotiated his business ventures. He had been part of the inner circle, among the select individuals O.J. trusted during the hurricane of the trial. Even following the not guilty verdict, Gilbert remained around, spared from public criticism, holding back his comments. But slowly, something changed within him. It wasn't until 2008, though, that Gilbert spoke out. He revealed in public a secret so disturbing that even the most doubting watchers slowed down. O.J., he said, had, in his own fashion, confessed to the murders. It was sometime late one evening, Gilbert said. Simpson had been drinking. His guard was down, removed from the polish and charm he presented to the world. And then, without tears, without drama, Simpson lectured in a tone that sent shivers down Gilbert's spine. The words weren't an outright confession like, "I did it," but the intent was clear. Gilbert called it, unmistakably real, a moment when truth seemed to weigh heavily in the air. The experience haunted him so profoundly that he ultimately penned a book recounting exactly what was said, how it was said, and the cold, detached expression O.J. showed in that moment. Gilbert steadfastly maintained it wasn't for notoriety, it was because bearing that truth had become intolerable. But Gilbert was not the only one. Another acquaintance, Ron Shipp, a veteran LAPD cop, also spoke up. Shipp had testified on Simpson's behalf at the trial, convinced of his innocence. But over time, doubt insidiously seeped in, undermining that conviction. There was one exchange in particular that lingered, replaying in his head for years. The days following the murders, as the LAPD badgered O.J. into submitting to a lie detector test, Shipp confronted him. "Why not just take it?" he asked. O.J.'s response was unnerving, "I've had dreams of slaying her." To Shipp, it wasn't merely a strange turn of phrase, it was a slip, a crack in the tightly guarded mask. Psychologists refer to this as leakage, when the subconscious overcomes the barrier and allows the truth to emerge indirectly. To Shipp, it didn't seem like a dream at all. It seemed like guilt, perverted, repressed, and encoded in the language of fantasy. What made it worse was that Shipp was familiar with Nicole's past with O.J. too well. He had witnessed the bruises on her face, the swelling of her eyes. She had revealed herself to him, trusting after bouts of violence. These were not rumors, there were photographs, visible marks, indisputable evidence of ongoing abuse. When Shipp once confronted Simpson with it, O.J. hadn't yelled, denied, or pleaded. He had only remained quiet. That quiet said everything. It told a pattern, one of control, intimidation, and physical abuse. O.J. hadn't merely fantasized about assaulting Nicole. He had already done it, repeatedly. And now, the man who used to be famous for running through airports in ads and captivating America with his smile appeared, to those closest to him, to be a different person altogether. Not an idol. Not an unfairly targeted victim of the justice system. But something much more sinister. When even your best supporters start backing off, not for convenience, but for fear, remorse, or guilt, it ceases to be conjecture. It begins to be revelation. And as it would happen, O.J. himself would subsequently present the world with his own version of what went down that evening, one that was appallingly graphic and frighteningly elaborate. By 2006, O.J. Simpson was no longer merely a retired NFL legend or Hollywood celebrity, he was the icon of one of America's most divisive criminal trials ever. The public was still decisively split. He was for some the casualty of an imperfect justice system, to others a man who had escaped punishment for a savage double murder. So when word came that Simpson was publishing a book called If I Did It, the outrage was swift and furious. The setup was sold as a hypothetical treatment, O.J.'s version of how the killings might have occurred if he was the murderer. But as readers started to devour it, tone and reporting indicated otherwise. From the very beginning chapter, the book never seemed like theory. It seemed like recollection. The settings were painted with icy accuracy that shook even experienced legal minds. The positions of the bodies. The gun. The point of confrontation. The feelings, or lack thereof, preceding the murders. These were things that creepily mirrored the real crime scene, down to details that had never been released during the trial. O.J. penned about strolling up the walkway to Nicole's condo. About the instant that the situation exploded into brutality. About someone blacking out and awakening with a knife in hand, standing over two lifeless corpses. He also brought in an unknown fictional co-conspirator called Charlie, who allegedly encouraged him to depart before the violence became fatal. But then, by design, O.J. blackout, and upon coming to, Nicole and Ron were deceased and Charlie had vanished. It sounded like a passage from a sinister psychological thriller, except it was written by a crime author. It was written by the sole survivor who knew precisely what really happened that night. The furor was so great that the initial publisher pulled the book. But in a curious legal irony, the rights to the book went to the Goldman family as part of their $33.5 million civil victory against Simpson. When it was finally published, the letter if in the title was reduced to insignificance, and the cover boldly declared, "I did it." The visual statement could not be overlooked. Despite the profits going to the Goldman family, the book is still one of the most incendiary works of media ever associated with the case. To some, it was O.J.'s final act of hubris, a taunt of the public, a rewriting of history in which he played the author. To others, it was a subconscious confession, in which the truth somehow filtered out from behind the thin veneer of fiction. For a man who had spent so many years proclaiming absolute innocence, the coziness and detail with which he wrote about two horribly brutal murders in his own voice was incredibly disquieting. Legal minds continue to argue whether the book was an act of cynical publicity or the result of a guilty mind. Either way, it blended fiction and fact, and O.J. appeared quite at ease being the one with the pencil. But one wondered, if O.J. had been guilty, was he acting alone? Of the innumerable theories of the murders, there is one that sets itself apart, not because it clears O.J., but because it targets someone even more intimate to him, his own son, Jason Simpson. The theory is not included in the official case file, nor was it ever presented in court, but it has been extensively probed by private investigator Bill Deere, who has spent over a decade reconstructing it. Deere's research, laid out in his book O.J. is guilty but not of murder, suggests a chilling scenario, that Jason, who was 24 at the time, perpetrated the killings, and that O.J. assisted in covering it up to shield him. Jason's past was disturbing. He had been diagnosed with intermittent rage disorder, a condition that causes sudden and violent rage attacks. He had also been arrested for attacking his boss with a knife, for which he received probation. Deere asserts that Jason had discontinued his prescribed antipsychotic medication just prior to the murders, possibly making him even more unstable. Ex-girlfriends also painted a similarly disturbing picture. One remembered him hurling her into a bathtub in a rage and threatening to kill her. Another reported that he had pinned her down and cut off her hair in a fit of jealousy. These events weren't random, they were part of a pattern of spontaneous, violent action. Then there was Jason's alibi. He had said he worked as a chef then, but Deere got his time card and detected a suspicious irregularity. The restaurant employed an electronic system, but Jason's time entry was handwritten. Why create a handwritten record unless there was a reason to conceal something? And last but not least, the knitted cap. Prior to June 12, 1994, pictures regularly depicted Jason sporting a black knit cap remarkably similar to the one discovered where the killing took place. Following that evening, said photos, and said cap, rarely again appeared. Add his knife history, his physical strength, his emotional instability, and the alibi inconsistencies, and Deere feels Jason not only had the ability to commit the murders, but also a motive.